Esther King had spent years living alone on her farmland, with the world around her convinced she was nothing more than a lonely, elderly black woman. To the men in their suits and boots, she seemed like an easy target, silent, isolated, and without anyone to stand by her. They tried everything, offering money, applying pressure, and even resorting to violence. Tires were slashed, her animals poisoned, and a harsh deadline was set. But what they didn't understand was Esther's past, a history steeped in the discipline of military sniper training, fought in quiet wars and won in the shadows. So when they arrived in the dead of night to take what was hers, they met an enemy they never expected. Esther didn't back down. She fought as if the war had never ended. Before we go further, let me know where you're tuning in from and make sure to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's story is one you definitely won't want to miss. The morning started with a calm only the land, tended by memories, could offer. As the first rays of gold painted the tips of the pecan trees, Esther stood on her porch, coffee in hand, eyes sweeping over the land she had inherited, protected, and cultivated. At 74, her back remained straight, her movements deliberate, and her breathing steady, not because time had been kind to her, but because she had spent a lifetime training her body to answer to discipline, not fear, pain, or threats. Her house, modest in appearance but fortified in all the ways that mattered, was perfectly maintained. Not for visitors, since they were rare, but because she knew that order was the language she understood best. Everything in her life had its place, from the curtains drawn in perfect rhythm to the stove wiped down as soon as it cooled. The porch was swept with even strokes, no matter how harsh the wind had been the night before. Her land wasn't just a home. It was a perimeter, a responsibility, and a living extension of every lesson war had carved into her bones. She had always known the land beneath her boots held secrets far older than her house. So when she noticed small disturbances, soil shifts near the northern field, a faint chemical odor after a storm, a change in the water runoff, she didn't panic. She simply took samples and, without telling anyone, quietly began securing her mineral rights through a trusted lawyer counties away. She moved slowly, strategically, like a mission she had led in the past. Yet, even with all her precautions, the word got out. Just weeks after the paperwork was filed, strange trucks appeared near her land. They started parked at the edge of her gravel road, slowly inching closer each time. The men inside wore no uniforms but carried themselves like they were used to controlling the room, not simply walking through it. The first time one of them came up her driveway, he wore a polished smile, a button-down shirt with rolled-up sleeves, casual but sharp. His voice was confident, the kind that's not used to being ignored. He introduced himself as a representative from a real estate group interested in rural acquisitions. He had heard about the value of her land and wanted to make her an offer that would respect her legacy while offering her the freedom to enjoy the rest of her years without burden. Esther hadn't invited him to sit, nor had she offered him coffee. She simply listened. Her silence stretched long enough to make him squirm before he handed her a pristine envelope with gold lettering. He suggested she take her time to think it over. She took the envelope without a word and waited until he left before even opening it. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and the cicadas filled the air with their pulse, Esther stood at the edge of her field, envelope in hand. She looked at the offer inside, a number so large it might have tempted another woman to pause, even dream. But Esther merely tilted her head slightly and looked across the land she had fought for, worked for, and buried her husband on. Not because it was valuable, but because it was hers. Esther didn't hesitate. There was no sigh, no second thought. She simply walked back to her house, opened the stove's iron door, and fed the offer to the flames. She watched, her face illuminated by the soft flicker of heat as the paper blackened, curled, and turned to ash. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was the mark of a decision already made. In her world, it meant that a line had been crossed and there would be no retreat, No negotiation, no warning the next time someone came asking about what lay beneath her land. By morning, the ash had cooled into a soft gray layer at the base of the stove, the only trace of the decision she had already sealed in her mind. Esther rinsed her coffee mug, tightened the laces on her boots, and stepped onto the porch with a quiet calm that needed no announcement. The first rays of light stretched across the fields, casting long golden bands. For a moment, everything looked the same. The distant tree line, the fencing, the gravel driveway. But something in the air had shifted, like the distant hum of a storm brewing far off on the horizon, hidden but undeniably present. She drove to the courthouse as the town began to stir, its streets still empty, storefronts locked in silence. Her truck rumbled steadily over the cracked asphalt, its bed empty, her passenger seat holding only a manila folder, prepared weeks ago. She had signed everything slowly, deliberately, her signature flowing across each form. It wasn't just ink, it was a claim, an intention, a defense. The courthouse lobby smelled faintly of floor polish and aging carpet, a scent that seemed to cling to the baseboards no matter how many years passed. Esther walked in, nodded politely at the security guard who barely looked up from his crossword, and headed to the records window. There, a young clerk with over-gelled hair and a name tag reading Derek sat behind a smudged pane of glass. Without a word, Esther slid the folder across the counter. Derek glanced up, did a quick double take as though he'd expected someone else, then sighed exaggeratedly as he took the documents, clearly irritated. He scanned the first page, tapping away at the keyboard with barely concealed impatience, muttering under his breath about older filings being a pain to index. Esther said nothing, just watched as his fingers moved too quickly to be thorough. When the confirmation screen finally appeared, he hesitated just long enough to glance toward the hallway leading to the sheriff's office. Without shame or subtlety, he pulled his phone from under the counter and sent a quick message, his thumb hovering over the screen like a man doing something routine but important. Esther made a note of how his eyes avoided hers as he handed back the receipt. No smile, no goodbye. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, warming the morning, but the chill in her stomach had nothing to do with the temperature. The clerk had sent a message. Someone would be coming. 2 days later, the SUV arrived. It moved slowly up the drive, its tires too clean, its suspension too smooth. It was the kind of vehicle that belonged in private garages, not on dusty gravel roads. Esther stood on the porch, already waiting. She hadn't armed herself visibly, but her stance was enough. The man who emerged from the vehicle wore a deep navy suit, intentionally unbuttoned at the collar, a pair of brown boots with just enough dust to make them look worn, and an expression that tried to project concern but barely masked calculation. His blonde hair was combed back with practiced ease, and his sunglasses hung from the second button of his shirt like a prop in a commercial. "Miss King?" he asked, stepping forward, expecting her to meet him halfway. She didn't move. "I'm Cal Briggs," he said, pausing as if his name should mean something to her. "I work with a group that partners with legacy landowners, people like you, who've built something valuable and might be ready to transition into the next chapter." Esther raised an eyebrow. Cal pressed on. "I wanted to speak with you directly, respectfully, before things got too formal. You've got a beautiful piece of property here, historic, with good bones, and under all this charm, well, let's just say there's real value waiting to be unlocked." He let the last word hang in the air like a salesman testing how far he could push, before revealing his leverage. "I'm not selling," Esther said flatly. Cal's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course not. Nobody's asking you to rush, but we'd like to put something on the table just so you know what's possible. We're not here to disrespect your legacy. Lord knows you've held this place down longer than most could, especially with everything going on out here." His eyes swept across the land as if searching for evidence that she couldn't handle it anymore, that the wear of time had finally caught up with her. Then he took a small envelope from his inner coat pocket and placed it gently on the porch railing beside her. Take a look when you're ready. There's more zeros than trouble. That I promise." Esther didn't look at the envelope. She looked at him. "You came out here to tell me I don't belong on my own land?" she asked. His smile tightened. "No, I came to give you an offer." Esther listened quietly, her gaze unwavering. "A choice," Cal said, his words dripping with an assumption that she didn't know what was best for her. "We like to work with people who understand that the world is changing. This isn't personal, it's just business. You've done well to hold on to this place, Miss King, but we both know land like this, it won't stay quiet much longer. Might as well get something while you can still call it yours." His words weren't vulgar, but the implication behind them was clear. The quiet suggestion that a woman like her, black, elderly, and alone on land that now held value to the right people, had somehow missed the memo that it was time to let go. She didn't flinch. Esther had lived long enough to recognize the tone beneath the surface, the control disguised as courtesy. She picked up the envelope, held it in her hand without opening it, and asked, "You finished?" Cal tilted his head, clearly surprised by her calm response. "Because if you're not, go ahead, I've got time," she continued, her voice even but lined with steel. "But if you are, then take your boots, your offer, and get off my land before I make you forget every dollar in that envelope." Cal's smile faltered. He gave a stiff nod, took one slow breath, and walked back to the SUV without another word. As he drove off, kicking up a cloud of dust that lingered long after the vehicle disappeared beyond the tree line, Esther stood still on the porch. The envelope still in her hand, she listened to the wind rolling across her fields like a quiet warning already answered. In the following days, the land seemed to hold its breath. The town, already shifting in tone, now felt completely drained of warmth. People who once waved from porches or exchanged greetings in the feed store now crossed the street when they saw her, their eyes quickly dropping to the ground as if something about her presence had become radioactive. No one spoke directly, but the silence was tangible, strategic, as if they were protecting something by keeping their distance. Esther caught it first, in the way the store clerk bagged her goods without looking her in the eye, or how the man at the gas station, who used to joke with her about the weather, now stiffened when she pulled up beside him. It wasn't fear nor pity. It was the same look she had seen on young soldiers in distant deserts, the one that said they had already decided not to get too close, not to care, because they didn't want to feel responsible for what happened next. Back at the farm, the signs grew bolder. The first incident was a tire, found the morning after a rain, the ground soft enough to reveal the shape of boots in the dirt. The prints had been smeared by a sweep of leaves, like someone had tried too hard to cover their tracks. The front driver's side tire of her truck had been slashed, not deep enough to make noise, but enough to fail at high speeds, enough to flip the vehicle if the timing was right. Esther didn't curse or call anyone. She simply changed the tire, marked the location in her notebook, and pulled out a longer route map from her desk drawer, one with off-grid travel lines in case the roads became unsafe. A few nights later, her water line burst without warning. At first, she thought it was just the age of the pipe, but when she pulled it from the ground, the break was too clean. The metal snipped as if by something far sharper than age. She boiled rainwater that night and drank it without comment. The next morning, she rerouted her filtration system and began storing emergency reserves in sealed containers. Then came the goat. She found her eldest nanny goat lying stiff and bloated, foam at the mouth, joints swollen, a clear sign of poisoning. Esther stood there for a long time, one hand braced against the fence rail, watching the last flies settle on the carcass like shadows with wings. She buried the goat herself at the edge of the north pasture, marking the grave with a stone, no name, no marker, just the land. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Esther descended into the cellar beneath the pantry. She opened the reinforced cabinet that hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. Inside, her sniper rifle lay in perfect alignment, wrapped in oiled cloth, each piece cleaned and checked every year on her birthday. not out of preparation, but out of habit. She unwrapped it slowly, testing the scope, calibrating the zero, running her fingers along the stock as though reading Braille. It was an extension of her body, as familiar to her as her own breath. She brought out her sidearm next, loading it with methodical care before sliding it into the holster at her waistband. She returned to the porch, not with fear, not with rage, but with a quiet sense of arrival, as if some long-dormant part of her had merely been waiting for permission to wake. The following days were spent walking the land in measured silence, not to admire or harvest, but to prepare. She moved through the fields with a tape measure, a compass, and a carpenter's chalk line, plotting distances, marking blind spots, and identifying shooting angles. It was a map of defense, of strategy, of a line she would not let anyone cross, and fine-tuning the camera angles, ensuring nothing went unnoticed. The quiet hum of technology in the background was a far cry from the days when all she needed were her own instincts and the weight of a rifle. But now, in a world that had grown too complex, she adapted, blending old ways with new. As the days passed, her preparations grew more intricate. She mapped out every inch of her land, marking not just the physical boundaries, but the unseen lines that connected every aspect of her defense. Her eyes, sharp from years of military experience, scanned for weaknesses, places where someone might think they had the advantage. She anticipated every move, every possibility, every variable. Her land had become a chessboard, and each move she made was a calculated step toward victory. The pressure on her farm, though subtle at first, continued to build. The days grew longer, but the town's cold shoulder never wavered. The odd looks, the silent avoidance, it was all part of the same story. They had marked her, cast her out, as if she no longer belonged, but that was a mistake. Esther belonged here more than any of them ever could, and she'd be damned if she let anyone forget it. Then, as the shadows lengthened on the evening of the 7th day, the next part of her plan fell into place. Cal Briggs and his men returned, this time with more than just words. The sight of the 2 black trucks, the same eerie silence, and the way they rolled down her gravel drive like an ominous storm made her muscles tighten. But this time, there was no hesitation in Esther's steps. She stood at the edge of her porch, hands tucked into her jacket pockets, watching them approach without a flicker of fear. Cal's previous pretense was gone, replaced by a quiet arrogance. He wasn't offering an envelope now. He stepped forward, flanked by the man with the faded military tattoos. Cal's voice, stripped of charm, came at her cold and flat. 2 weeks. That's all you've got left to come to your senses. He glanced around at her land, his gaze calculating, as if deciding how much it was worth to him. You won't be able to stop what's coming, and you'll regret not taking what we offered while it was still intact. Esther didn't flinch. She didn't respond. She just stared at him, waiting for him to finish his empty threat. When he turned and walked away, the only sound left was the wind shifting through the tall grass and the low hum of his truck as it rumbled off, disappearing into the encroaching dark. That night, she slept lightly, her senses on high alert. The decision had already been made, not out of fear, but because there was no other choice. The next day, Esther walked the land again, this time as a soldier, not a farmer. She recalculated the terrain, retraced every path, every vantage point. She knew where she needed to be, where the enemy would likely strike. She knew how to turn the land into a fortress, how to turn every inch of it into a tool of survival. The wire traps, hidden by leaves and set with copper threads, were just the start. Each trap, each line of defense, was placed with precision, her hands steady, her mind focused. The perimeter alarms, the pressure switches, the cameras, each part of the system fed into a single purpose, to protect what was hers. And as she moved through the barn, reinforcing every door, every entry point, She felt the weight of her preparations settle into place. Her husband's old journals, the maps, the external drive, these weren't just relics of the past. They were her lifeline. They held the key to everything, the reason she knew exactly what she was up against. By the third day, the hidden cameras were set, the feed from each one projected across her laptop screen. She watched the landscape unfold in real time, every movement of the trees, every shift in the shadows. The cameras revealed everything, every inch of her land, every person who dared approach. Esther wasn't just ready. She was prepared for what came next. The wind, the silence, the waiting, it was all part of the plan. She wasn't just protecting a piece of land. She was standing her ground, ready to fight for what she had earned, what she had protected with her blood, sweat, and tears. And this time, the world would learn that the price for crossing her would be steep as she moved through the wet earth with precision. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, a quiet dance between shadow and cover. She knew her terrain, knew the advantages she had, and most importantly, she knew how to move without being seen. The world felt like it was holding its breath, the only sound the soft rhythm of her movements as she crawled, keeping her rifle close and her senses sharper than ever. Her mind was clear, focused. She'd been in situations like this before, but this was different. This wasn't a mission sanctioned by the military or a brief operation to neutralize an enemy. This was her land, her home, and every ounce of her being was dedicated to keeping it. As she made her way across the field, the tension in the air grew, but Esther remained calm, her body functioning like a machine, trained for moments like these. She reached the edge of the irrigation trench and paused for a moment to check her surroundings. The sound of boots crunching the gravel was getting closer, but she knew they weren't close enough to detect her yet. She continued her crawl, silent but swift. Reaching the tree line, she took cover behind a large oak, adjusting her position so she could see the three remaining figures as they regrouped, trying to form a defensive circle. They were scanning the horizon, their eyes darting back and forth, searching for any sign of where the shot had come from. Esther smiled slightly, the satisfaction of being in control humming quietly inside her. They weren't prepared for someone who knew how to play their game better than they did. From her new position, she adjusted her scope, zeroing in on the second man from the right, a large, broad-shouldered figure who was still scanning the area, completely unaware of how exposed he was. She held her breath, the world around her narrowing into the reticle of her scope. Every part of her was still, every muscle in her body taut, waiting for the perfect moment. It came in an instant. As the man moved slightly, shifting his weight to step forward, Esther squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, quiet but deadly, the suppressed rifle making a soft pop. The man collapsed, his body crumpling forward just as he reached the fence, unable to stop his fall. The others had no idea where the shots were coming from, still thinking they were dealing with a lone sniper far away, not realizing they were being picked off one by one in the dead of night. Without hesitation, Esther slid into another position, moving lower to the ground as the remaining targets began to scatter. They were disoriented, their coordinated movements breaking down as panic began to set in. But it was too late for them. Esther had already calculated her next move. She shifted again, moving quickly through the trees, her boots silent on the damp soil, as she positioned herself for another shot. She had them right where she wanted them. The final shot was clean. The last man, a younger figure, perhaps less experienced, desperate, was caught in her sights as he bolted for cover. He never had a chance. She squeezed the trigger once more, and the bullet hit its mark, sending him stumbling backward into the brush. The sounds of his struggle were drowned by the quiet of the land, as though the earth itself had swallowed his last breath. Esther took a slow, deliberate breath, her body still steady, not showing any sign of exertion. She wasn't just defending her land. She was sending a message, a reminder that no one would ever take what was hers without consequence. She had fought too many battles in too many places to let it end any other way. This was her fight, her victory, and this land would remain hers. She rose from the ground, moving with the same deliberate pace she always had. She'd made her mark, and now the rest of the world could deal with the consequences. The battle had only just begun. But Esther King wasn't about to let anyone forget who controlled these fields, and pressed her back against it, her eyes narrowing in the direction of the sound. She didn't need to see him to know what was coming. She could hear the deliberate slowness in his movements, the hesitation that told her he wasn't sure where she was or how many of them were still standing. It didn't matter. She was in control now, just as she had always been. With a swift motion, she slid the blade back into its sheath and reached for her sidearm again. Every step of the way, her instincts had guided her, her body moving with the precision of years spent in war zones, in ambushes, and in silence. No longer a farmer, she was a soldier on her own land, and this was her battlefield. She didn't wait for him to step into her line of sight. Esther knew better than to give him the luxury of that. Instead, she spun, dropping low and sweeping her feet out from under her, her body sliding across the floor in one fluid motion, just as he entered her peripheral vision. The moment he took a step into the dining room, she was there, her pistol raised and fired in a single fluid motion. The shot caught him square in the chest, sending him stumbling backward into the wall. His gun fell with a loud clatter, but Esther didn't wait to see if he was down. She moved forward again, closing the distance between them, her boots silent on the floorboards, the world narrowing to the task at hand. The air in the house was heavy now, thick with tension, the scent of smoke and blood merging with the cold metal tang of fear. But Esther didn't feel fear, only focus. She had spent her life preparing for moments like this, and each one was a lesson learned, honed to perfection. As she reached the fallen man, she checked his pulse with a practiced hand. He was still alive, but just barely. His eyes, wide and filled with a mix of disbelief and panic, met hers. There was no pleading, no last words, just the understanding that this was the end of the line for him. Without hesitation, Esther holstered her pistol, drew the blade from her belt once more, and ended it in a quick, controlled motion. The blood pooled on the floor beneath him, a stark contrast to the polished hardwood, a symbol of the price of trespassing on her land. She stood over him for a moment, letting the silence settle, the weight of what had just transpired soaking in. She didn't need to celebrate, nor did she need to take satisfaction. The work had been done. The warning had been made. And just as quickly as the danger had entered her home, it was gone. But Esther knew it wouldn't be the last of them. It never was. Still, she stood there, eyes scanning the darkened house, waiting for the next move. In the end, the only thing that mattered was the land, her home. And as long as she was here, it would stay that way, safe, protected, untouched. Their eyes and stumbling around the kitchen, trying to regain some semblance of control. Esther moved like a shadow, low to the ground, silent but deadly. The house, filled with the acrid scent of smoke and blood, felt like her battlefield, an environment she had mastered in countless other locations, but this time it was personal. This was her home, and she would defend it like a lioness protecting her cubs. As she maneuvered through the smoke, she reached the hallway just in time to hear footsteps coming toward her from the kitchen. Without hesitation, she grabbed a heavy kitchen knife from the counter and positioned herself just around the corner. Her breathing slowed, her senses sharpening, waiting for the perfect moment. The first man appeared, still blinking and disoriented from the flare. He staggered into the hallway, rifle held in front of him, but he never saw her coming. Esther stepped from the shadows, her movements swift and controlled. She planted her knee into his back, pushing him hard against the wall, and with a quick motion, slashed the knife across his throat. His weapon fell to the ground with a dull thud as he gasped and crumpled. The second man, slightly behind, wasn't as close to being blindsided, but his movements were still uncoordinated. He raised his rifle, but before he could get a shot off, Esther grabbed the fallen weapon and swung it up, striking him across the jaw with the stock. He staggered back, and Esther followed through, driving the barrel of the rifle into his chest, knocking the air out of him. She didn't waste time. As his mouth opened to scream, she slammed the rifle butt into his throat, ending it in one fluid motion. She moved quickly, too quickly for the remaining intruders to react. They had expected her to be cornered by now, but instead, she was systematically eliminating their numbers with precision and ruthless efficiency. The chaos had turned in her favor. She was the predator, they the prey. Esther crouched down, staying low, and listened carefully. There was still movement on the stairs, more men coming. She adjusted her position, sliding into the shadows again, and waited. As the next intruder rounded the corner, rifle raised, Esther lunged from the darkness, grabbing him by the wrist and twisting it so forcefully that the gun fell to the floor. She slammed his head into the wooden floorboards with a sickening thud, knocking him unconscious. The sounds of the battle outside had faded, but inside it was pure chaos. Yet in this chaos, Esther had found her calm. She checked her sidearm, then her secondary blade. Both were ready. The last man she had to deal with was a younger, more reckless type. He had underestimated her before, and now he would pay the price. By the time he realized he was the only one left standing, it was already too late. Esther stepped forward, her hand steady as she aimed at his chest. He barely had time to raise his weapon before she fired, the shot sending him crumbling backward, his life extinguished in an instant. The silence that followed was deafening. Esther stood amidst the wreckage, her breathing steady but her body aching with the toll of the fight. Every inch of her was alive with the energy of the battle, yet beneath that energy was a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had held her ground. Her land was still hers, her legacy intact. Her eyes swept over the bodies of the fallen, and she knew the fight was far from over. This was only the beginning. She had sent a message, but it would take more than one night to end this. They would return, and when they did, she would be waiting. But for now, the house was silent, and Esther could finally allow herself a moment of peace. She knew what was coming next. It wasn't fear she felt, just the clarity of someone who had lived a lifetime in battle. She had made it through the night, and she would make it through whatever came after. Esther's voice remained calm, but there was a steel edge to it now, a quiet force that reverberated through the barn. "Answer me," she urged, her eyes locked on the young man, who seemed to be fighting his own internal battle. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the struggle in his eyes. He had been trained to endure, to resist. But Esther had broken stronger men than him before, and this was not the first time she had turned silence into a weapon. The man shifted again, his chair creaking under the strain, but this time he didn't look away. Sweat continued to bead on his forehead, his breath shallow and rapid. She didn't have to say anything more. The air itself was thick with expectation. "I'm not dying for you," he rasped, his voice hoarse, the words barely a whisper. Esther stepped closer, her movements measured, her boots soft against the barn's floor. She didn't need to raise her voice, but her presence loomed over him, heavy and undeniable. "Then who are you dying for?" she repeated, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. His gaze flickered momentarily to Cal, still sitting in his chair, silent and bloodied. But Esther saw the brief flash of recognition, the guilt, the acknowledgement of where he stood now. His eyes shifted back to her, his lips parted, but the words didn't come easily. Esther didn't press. She knew the weight of silence was more effective than any threat she could make. She stood still, watching him, her posture unwavering. The room remained heavy with tension, the only sounds the occasional drip of water, the creaking wood, and the faint hum of the barn settling into its own rhythm. Finally, the young man exhaled, his chest heaving as if the air had become too thick for him to breathe. He began, then paused. His voice cracked, the struggle to speak more than just a physical one. His entire body was betraying him, his nerves unraveling. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, sweat mixing with blood, and finally, through gritted teeth, he spoke. It's not just for him. It's for the money, the power, and they made us believe it was for the right cause. Esther tilted her head slightly, not a sign of judgment in her expression, but something deeper, a quiet understanding. You don't believe that anymore, do you? She asked softly. He swallowed, his eyes downcast, unable to meet her gaze. The silence in the barn seemed to deepen, pressing in on him. His hands trembled as they rested on his knees, and his breathing grew more labored. The reality of his situation, the choices he had made, the consequences of those choices, was sinking in. Esther stood still, watching him process it all, letting the weight of his words settle in the silence. She didn't need him to apologize. She didn't need him to beg for mercy. The truth was enough for her. Slowly, without a word, she turned and walked back to the corner of the barn. She retrieved a small, battered journal from one of the shelves, flipping through the pages until she found the section she was looking for. Her husband's handwriting filled the pages, neat and precise, as always. She ran her fingers across the lines, remembering the days when they had both worked together, when their focus had been survival, not just for them, but for something greater. The war had shaped them, but it had also shaped the land they had fought for, and it was her responsibility now. With the journal in hand, she returned to the men. Cal still sat slumped in his chair, his face bruised and bloody, but his eyes were open and he was watching her. His pride was gone, but the defiance in his gaze still lingered. She walked past him without a word, her focus on the young man who had spoken. "The game has changed," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's not about power anymore, not for you, not for me. It's about who's still standing when the dust clears." The young man didn't respond. He didn't need to. Esther knew the battle was not over, but she had won this one. And in the silence that followed, the barn seemed to settle, as if acknowledging that the fight was hers now, in ways that went beyond guns and traps. It was a fight for control, a fight for her land, her home. She looked out the small window, the faint light of dawn creeping into the barn. The day was beginning, and she was ready. Esther sat in the quiet of her kitchen, the journal still open before her, the weight of its contents pressing on her chest. Her fingers traced the pages as if the words could reveal something more, something she hadn't yet fully understood. But the truth was clear now, in the starkest form possible. Her husband had known. He had always known what was coming, and he had tried, quietly and methodically, to slow it. She closed the ledger gently, setting it down on the table beside her. The morning light had shifted, softening the sharpness of the previous night's chaos, but the knowledge in her hands felt like a stone that wouldn't budge. Her husband had been working in the shadows, protecting her from a truth she had not been ready to face. He had hidden it all in the pages of this ledger, buried deep beneath the surface of what she thought was a simple life on their land. The door to the barn remained closed, its contents still lingering in her mind. The men, bound and silent, were nothing more than pawns in a much larger game, and Esther had just played her part. She had taken control of the story, spun it into a narrative that would no longer be twisted or silenced. As she moved through the house, the weight of the morning settled into her bones. The adrenaline had dulled to a quiet ache, but there was something else, something deeper. The sun was up now, the light no longer just creeping over the horizon, but fully claiming the day. Yet, the light didn't feel clean. It didn't feel like a new beginning. It felt like the calm after the storm, the kind that comes before the next wave of violence. Her boots pressed into the earth again as she stepped outside, the chill of the morning seeping into her skin. She walked the edge of the property slowly, her pace unhurried, but deliberate. Each step was a reminder of what had happened and what was still to come. The wind rustled the trees, a soft, whispering reminder that silence had a way of revealing its own truth. As she walked, she thought about the gas, the mineral content beneath the soil, the truth her husband had hidden from her, the truth he had tried to protect her from. It had been there, buried deep beneath the surface of their land, and now it was only a matter of time before the world came for it. The world had always been after something from her family, but now it was clearer than ever. She thought of Cal and the others, the men who had come for her land, who had underestimated her at every turn. They thought they could play their game with her, but they hadn't counted on the depth of her knowledge, the years of experience she had inherited from a man who knew how to fight, even after the war was over. They hadn't counted on her silence, her patience. Esther paused near the willow tree, looking out at the distant horizon. The world was changing, and she would be ready for it. The men in the barn would eventually be dealt with, their stories would be told, but there was something larger at play now, something that could no longer be ignored. The property was hers. It always had been, and the world would learn that when Esther King stood her ground, there was no taking it from her. Not now, not ever. The fight was far from over, but she had already started the next move. And no one, not Cal, not Cobb, and not anyone else, would stop her from seeing it through to the end. She exhaled slowly, her breath a cloud in the cold morning air, and walked back toward the house, the land beneath her feet steady and unyielding, like the promise of what was still to come. Presence, a signature of the meticulous care with which she handled every step of this next chapter. She made no effort to hide her movements, but she didn't need to. The anonymity in which she worked now was more effective than any disguise. It was the calm before the storm, the kind that only those who had truly learned how to fight understood. Esther's hands were steady as she placed the final package in the mail slot, her thoughts already turning to the next move. The world was beginning to understand what she had known all along, the quiet power of information. She had learned from the best, her husband, who had spent years gathering the fragments of a puzzle that no one had been willing to see. He had fought too, just in a different way. His methods had been slow and hidden, but they had worked, until they didn't. Now it was her turn to finish the work. The afternoon sun bathed the truck in golden light as Esther drove back to her property. Her mind was already calculating the responses that would come in the next days and weeks. The packages she had sent would set in motion a chain of events. They would stir the pot, bring the truth to the surface, and expose the web of corruption that had rooted itself in every corner of the county. Cobb would have no choice but to answer, and when he did, there would be no place for him to hide. As she pulled into the driveway, the barn doors loomed ahead, silent witnesses to everything that had transpired. The men inside had been quiet since her visit, but she knew they would speak soon enough. The game had changed, and they too would feel the weight of the truth. Esther parked the truck and sat for a moment, letting the stillness wash over her. The land around her, the very earth beneath her feet, felt different now, like it had shifted, not just in the physical sense, but in a way that spoke to something deeper. She wasn't just protecting her home anymore. She was protecting the truth, and that was a force far more dangerous than any weapon. She walked toward the barn, her boots making soft impressions in the earth. The weight of the day settled in her chest, but her resolve was unwavering. Every piece was falling into place. The files, the drives, the confessions, it was all coming together. The truth had a way of doing that, pulling everything into focus, making sense of what had once been chaotic. When she reached the barn, she paused for a moment outside the door. She could feel the presence of the men inside, even though she couldn't hear them. They knew what was coming, and she was ready. Esther opened the door, stepping into the dim light of the barn. The men were still bound to the chairs, their eyes shifting as they saw her enter. But this time, there was no intimidation in her step. no hesitation in her gaze. She was ready to take the next step, to bring everything to its final conclusion. "You've had your time," she said, her voice low and unyielding. "Now you'll answer for it." The men didn't speak. They couldn't. The truth was already in motion, and it would reach them soon enough. For now, Esther was the one who held the cards. She had survived the storm, and now it was time to let the world see what had been hidden in the shadows for far too long. She walked past them, her movements slow and deliberate, knowing that the end of this chapter was just the beginning of something bigger. The land was hers, but more importantly, the story was hers to tell, and in the telling, the truth would be the weapon that brought the change she had been fighting for. Across the country, the full weight of what had been set into motion began to unfold. The raids continued, methodical and swift, one location after another dismantled in a single, coordinated sweep. The quiet hum of authorities moving through the shadows seemed to reverberate in the air, like the low thrum of something long buried finally breaking the surface. For those who had been operating in the dark, for years believing their deeds would never see the light, the reckoning had arrived, and it was inevitable. Esther remained steadfast in her quietude, letting the distant sound of the unfolding storm wash over her without a single word. She had learned that true strength didn't always show itself in loud, obvious bursts of power, but in the small, deliberate actions that ultimately built a path to something far greater. Inside her house, everything was as it should be. The land was still hers, her name still unshaken, and with that truth came a quiet sort of peace, a peace that had eluded her for years, ever since her husband had first passed away. Now, it was hers to carry, but it was also hers to protect. Every file, every document, every recording, everything she had done to expose the truth was just a tool. The real victory wasn't in the fight, nor in the battles that had been won, but in the survival of the legacy her husband had left behind. The work would continue, but it had already shifted. The world was watching now. As the days passed, Esther received word from Mariah. The wheels were turning quickly. More pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, each confirmation, each piece of new evidence, bringing them closer to the full unraveling of Cobb's empire. There was no turning back now. The layers of corruption that had once seemed so well hidden were being exposed, one by one, like the peeling away of centuries-old wallpaper revealing the damage beneath. What was once thought indestructible was beginning to crumble, and those who had built their fortunes on lies were now facing the consequences of their choices. In the quiet solitude of her home, Esther felt a sense of finality begin to settle in. The weight of her decisions, the sacrifices made, the truth revealed, it all felt like a slow, steady burn. It wasn't just a matter of vengeance or justice, but of reclaiming what had been taken from her, what had been taken from the land. No longer would the shadows dominate. Now, it was the truth that would lead the way. She had fought the war she never asked for. And now, as the sun rose over her fields, casting long stretches of amber light across the land, she knew that the work was only beginning. The next chapter was still unwritten, but it was hers to write, and no one, no force, no amount of corruption would take that from her. Esther turned away from the window, the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but never breaking her. Her resolve was unshakable. The land, her home, her truth, they were all intertwined, and nothing would sever that bond. The silence outside had spoken, and now it was time for the world to hear it, loud and clear. She stepped back into the kitchen, her hand resting on the radio once more. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about making sure the story was told, the truth was heard, and the legacy she and her husband had built would remain. Esther knew that whatever came next, she would be ready. Embedded in the broken wood, each detail was a mark of precision, a testament to Esther's unwavering resolve. The authorities, both local and federal, processed the scene methodically. but they didn't need to ask the questions that might have lingered in the minds of others. The scene spoke for itself, a careful balance of force and restraint, of survival and justice, crafted by a woman who had known what it meant to protect what was hers. As the days went by, Esther's name became synonymous with something more than resistance. It became a symbol of defiance. The headlines, once filled with the usual corporate news and political spin, now carried the weight of a story that had been quietly simmering beneath the surface for years. It wasn't just about the land or the mineral rights. It was about a woman who had fought back against a system designed to crush people like her, and had done so with the kind of quiet strength that no one could have predicted. The arrests and the indictments continued to unfold, the chain of corruption revealing itself in ways that staggered even the most seasoned investigators. The scope of the conspiracy, encompassing state officials, corporate moguls, and even some law enforcement, became a map of betrayal that stretched far beyond the boundaries of her own county. As names were crossed off and resignations piled up, it became clear that what had started as an isolated battle for her property was now a war against an entire system. Esther didn't watch the news. She didn't care for the recognition. The media could speculate all they wanted, but the truth had already been established. She had claimed victory, but not in the way most would have expected. Her work, her fight, had never been about seeking praise. It had been about survival for herself, her land, and the memory of her husband. The barn doors remained open, a subtle reminder to anyone who dared to pass by that nothing had been left unresolved. Inside, the men who had been held captive, those who had once thought they could push her into submission, had been processed without incident, their fate sealed by the very weight of the evidence they had tried to bury. And as the sun continued its slow rise each morning, Esther remained steadfast, watching over the land that had withstood not only the tests of time, but also the violence of greed and corruption. The cost of underestimating her was now clear, and those who had dared to cross her path would carry the burden of their choices forever. Esther had endured, and as the days wore on, she found herself walking the land, her boots leaving deep impressions in the dirt, not as a symbol of struggle, but as a mark of ownership. The sun burned low on the horizon as she stood near the barn, the weight of the victory settling into the earth beneath her feet. This was her land, her legacy, and no one could take it from her. The past had been reclaimed, and the future was hers to shape. And Esther couldn't help but smile as she watched the little dog race around the yard, its tail a blur of motion. It had been a gift from one of the volunteers who had helped with the repairs on the shed, a small sign of life and renewal after so many years of struggle. The pup had a lot of energy, as if trying to make up for all the quiet that had settled over the land in the wake of the chaos. It raced past Esther's feet, skidding on the gravel, then back to the porch with a high-pitched bark that echoed against the still morning air. Esther leaned back in her chair, the warmth of the sun slowly spreading over her, and watched the dog as it circled around. She had always been a woman who moved with purpose, who acted when needed. But in this moment, with the gentle hum of the land around her and the small, energetic creature bringing life to the porch, she allowed herself a moment of stillness. Mariah, who had joined her at the table, smiled faintly as she sipped her coffee, the familiar comfort of their routine settling between them like an unspoken understanding. They didn't need words for this, just the quiet of the land, the sound of the dog's playful barks, and the steady rhythm of the world turning. The work wasn't done, not yet. There were still lands to protect, still systems to challenge, and still threats to confront, wrapped in more polished language than ever before. But the foundation had been laid. The King Land Trust was growing, slowly but surely. There was power in ownership, power in the quiet acts of preserving what was once at risk, and in the resilience of the people who had come to help build it all back up. "Next year," Mariah said, breaking the silence as she set down her cup, "we'll have more acres, more land to protect." Esther nodded, her gaze soft, her hand resting lightly on the railing of the porch. "Next year," she echoed, the certainty in her voice unwavering, one step at a time. She stood up then, the pup scampering to her feet, ready for whatever the day would bring. With a final glance at Mariah, Esther walked across the porch, her boots firm against the weathered boards, as she headed toward the new structure being built at the edge of the property. The retreat was a place of healing, of refuge for those who had been lost, those who had fought and endured and needed to find a new purpose in the silence. It wasn't just about defending the land anymore. It was about giving others the space to heal, to rebuild, and to remember that no matter how hard the fight, there was always something worth preserving. As she walked down the path, the sunlight caught on the new wood, the fresh stains still dark and rich, a stark contrast to the old scars that had once marked the land. The new shed, the new structures, and the quiet presence of the people who respected this place were all part of the legacy she was creating, a legacy of strength, resilience, and quiet defiance. The wind carried through the trees, whispering softly, just as it had before, but now it felt different, warmer, gentler, a sign of something new beginning. And as the dog barked happily behind her, Esther couldn't help but feel the weight of the years behind her slowly lifting, leaving only the promise of a future she would continue to build, one piece at a time. The final broadcast had a quiet power to it, far beyond the words spoken or the images shown. It wasn't about the spectacle. It was about the story being told in a way that couldn't be altered or softened. Esther's presence was the story, her calm, her resolve, her quiet dignity in the face of everything she had endured. She hadn't fought for recognition, and she wasn't about to start now. As the camera panned over the land, the once battle-worn dirt now beginning to show new signs of life, viewers could see the transformation that had taken place, not just in the earth, but in the legacy she had reclaimed. This wasn't about a single victory. It was about the long term, the quiet reclaiming of what had always been hers. The fight wasn't over, but it was different now. It was no longer about survival. It was about preservation, of history, of land, and of dignity. The broadcast ended, not with a triumphant flourish, but with the soft sound of her boots against the earth, the steady rhythm of her work. Bullet, her faithful companion, nosed through the freshly turned soil beside her, marking his place in the history of that land, just as she had. In the years that followed, the land became more than just a symbol of resistance. It became a foundation for something lasting. The King Land Trust grew quietly and steadily, continuing the work that Esther had started. She didn't need statues or accolades. She didn't need to be immortalized in speeches or articles. Her victory was in the land itself, protected, preserved, and passed on. And so, the land rested, not as a battlefield, but as a place for growth, for healing, and for remembering, a place where the ghosts of the past could finally rest, and where the future could breathe freely without fear of being stolen or forgotten.